Hey, hi everybody. Welcome to the Method to Our Madness podcast. I'm Stacey Marola, PhD, and I'm here with my co-host, Bill Pate.
Hello.
And today we have a very, very special guest, my good friend John Hitchcock, who's going to be talking with us today about mixed methods. In an earlier episode, we had mentioned mixed methods research, but we didn't really define it. So we invited John on today to talk about mixed methods. So, John, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Stacy. So I'm John Hitchcock, and I am a professor at the University of Minnesota, also known as the Golden Gophers. I operate in a department called the Organizational Leadership Policy and Development, and I joined the University of Minnesota in August of 2025, and I say this with some humility. They gave me a pretty cool title. I have to look it up. I am the Marilyn Sime Professor for Educational Excellence. So I guess what that means is when I say things about mixed methods, if I'm going to live up to that title, I better know what I'm talking about.
Cool. So how would you define mixed methods in like a nutshell?
It's in prep for this, actually, I thought I would look up a highly cited definition for this, which I'll read out loud because it's relatively short, and then I'll riff on it for a moment. But back in 2007, a colleague of mine, Burke Johnson, some other folks on defining mixed methods, and they say it's the type of research in which a researcher or team of researchers combine elements of qualitative and quantitative research approaches. So for example, using qualitative and quantitative viewpoints, quantitative and qualitative forms of data collection, analyses, and inference techniques. And the reason why one would do this is for the broad purposes of both breadth and depth of understanding of whatever it is you happen to be studying. So, mixed methods, in essence, is this idea that we remain open to lots of different forms of inquiry. And it's actually considered a special case of something called multiple methods. Some sociologists actually worked on this. This is more your area, Stacy. Hunter, Brewer, and Schmidt, as I recall, talked about this idea of saying, well, we can have multiple methods. And so what does that mean? And so you can have multiple quantitative methods to pursue a research question. A classic might be something like structural equation modeling is going to entail facets of descriptive quantitative work, factor analytic work, and regression. And so because you're using all these forms of methods, structural equation modeling would be seen as a multi-method quantitative approach. Less discussed, but still out there, is the notion of using multiple qualitative methods. So you could have a multi-qualitative approach that's out there. And that might be some scenario where, let's say, for example, I'm blending elements of ethnography and case study and phenomenology in a way that helps me address the question that I have at hand.
Um,
So when you're using both quantitative and qualitative inquiry, mixed methods is seen as a special case of the multi-method way of thinking. And so basically, if you're not using both quantitative and qualitative work, it doesn't fit that particular definition of mixed methods that I was just going over that Burke Johnson and colleagues came up with. And the other aspect to then mixed methods is I take it a step back and try to keep it simple and think through, okay, what's my research question? And can I better answer my research question if I think about blending different approaches, like some form of statistical analysis that might be better explain my findings if I follow up with some sort of so in short, mixed methods entails blending or integrating quantitative and qualitative forms of inquiry to answer a research question.
I like that a lot. And there's a level of like pragmatism to it, right? It's sort of like I mean, I don't know. I remember like, back in the 90s when I was in graduate school, there was this whole, I know I'm old, Bill's smiling. Back in the 90s, there was the whole like, oh, everything has to be quantitative or, and then the qualitative people like, no, no, you need to do interviews. So it's sort of like
Mhm.
two, spheres, or I was thinking about like two
Yeah.
kingdoms. Like
We
Silos?
actually,
Yeah, it's
I'm in
definitely a
the
silo
quantitative one and
thing.
I'm in
Yeah.
the
yeah.
qualitative one, and or it's
Mhm.
like I don't know those old was it the Reese's peanut butter cups? You could have your peanut butter and your
Oh,
Yep.
chocolate.
yeah, yeah. There's
What if you
actually
put
there's
them
really a
together?
Yeah, there's a really dramatic phrase to capture what you're talking about in the literature. It's called the paradigm wars. And
Paradigm warp, yes.
Oh,
that's what you're
yeah.
looking for. And so why I call that a dramatic phrase is because the word war is used in it. And I think that becomes an academic thing. You had the reading wars, you had the math wars, you had the behaviorism wars, you had the paradigm wars. A friend of mine wrote a really interesting article about this. He's a huge name in mixed methods, Anthony Onwuegbuzie. And he had actually seen the war zone. And in one of his articles, it appears in the International Journal of Multiple Research Approaches, circa 2012. One of the points he made in that is, can we stop calling these wars? They're arguing. Let's
Right.
calm down.
Right.
Yeah, I might run into someone who rejects the paradigmatic assumptions under mixed methods research. It doesn't mean I want to shoot at them. It just so
Right.
let's put it in proper place. So yeah, the paradigm wars are, they're interesting. That we'll call them. I'll try to stick with paradigmatic arguments. And so a paradigm, it's one of those words that gets sort of thrown around in the culture and is I think made fun of because it's a fancy way of saying worldviews. But we want to sound smart, so we use paradigm, and we want to sound important, so we use wars. But there is this notion of what's called the incompatibility thesis, which is this idea that I think was articulated last in an education research article circa in the 80s. I forget the author, but basically the idea behind it is that if you really understand qualitative inquiry, you cannot, by definition, use quantitative methods. And
Interesting.
Oh, interesting.
yeah, can't do it. Incompatibility. They're incompatible. That's the thesis. And of course, I myself and every single mixed methods person overtly or at least inherently rejects that idea. You had a reaction when I said it because on the face of it, it sort of doesn't stand up very well.
No.
There is this issue, and I've run into this with some colleagues from time to time, because if you start to get into these paradigms, okay, well, what are the paradigms that are out there? And it turns out there's a list of them. You have constructivist paradigms, you have pragmatism as a kind of paradigm, which is actually, and pragmatism is an idea, isn't just about methods. Pragmatism, if I recall correctly, and I want to look this up if anybody checked me, but I even think like Oliver Wendell Holmes was considered a pragmatist, and there's a pragmatist ways of thinking about conducting statistical analyses. Yeah, positivism, which formally
Hmm.
speaking, it has largely been rejected. I think when people say that they're a positivist now, they mean a post-positive approach. It's not exactly the same thing.
Yeah, we
Uh,
actually mentioned Auguste Comte on an earlier podcast.
oh wow,
Streaming.
what a nerdy
Oh,
lot we are.
yeah, I know.
This is what happens when you go to a methods podcast. Other paradigms that are out there. There's something like a transformative paradigm. There's also participatory paradigms, and when you really get into something like pragmatism, you could deconstruct that even further. There's the so-called pragmatists of the left, pragmatists of the center, pragmatism of the right. There's all these different approaches of thinking about this, and my take on that, I'm going to go back to my colleague Burke Johnson again, who's done a lot of work in philosophical traditions and methodology, and he sort of resurrects this idea that's been around since the ancients. It's a dialectical pluralism, and if you break that apart, it sounds fancy,
Hmm.
but it's not. When I teach this stuff in class, I ask my students, well, when you hear the word dialectical, what?
Karl
Well, see,
Marx and I think of Karl
yeah,
Marx and Hegel.
right. But in that you hear the word dialogue, right?
Oh yeah, you do hear that too.
Yeah, that's that. But so that's sort of the more pedestrian way, which is, I think, a good thing. I mean, by saying something's pedestrian, it means it's accessible to me. And when we hear pluralism, it's multiple viewpoints, right? The pluralistic. And so the thinking roughly behind dialectical pluralism is this idea that we have to have a dialogue, and by being pluralistic, lots of different viewpoints that are out there, and no single person has all the answers. In fact, there's this old phrase. It's been attributed to lots of different people. If you Google this, you'll see that it's one of those quotes that has different variants, and we're not sure who came up with it initially. But the idea basically is, seek out those or follow those who seek out the truth, and try to run away from people who say they have found it.
Huh, that's awesome.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think
that's good.
that's a way to think about dialectical pluralism, because if I'm out there describing my pragmatist paradigm, I have to be open to the fact that and sometimes it may not be the best way to think about something. I'm not always right, and there might be someone who's got more of a post-positive way of looking at the world that's more convenient at the moment. And so when you're engaged in mixed methods, especially when you're getting into really advanced mixed methods, like think about things like applying qualitative inquiry to help you with things like item response theory. And I could explain how that would work.
Ooh.
But we do kind of get pretty deep into it, which means you're normally dealing with teams of researchers. But the way that I think about this is I do have a set of paradigms. I've reflected on them often. I very much am in the pragmatist way of thinking about this. And pragmatism has been criticized heavily by some of my colleagues. And I think one of the things about pragmatism is it's got a great advantage that is also a disadvantage.
Mm.
Its advantage is you could really kind of get the tenets of it in phrasing that'll fit on a bumper sticker. And in a nutshell, tell me your research question, and I'll tell you your methodology. Pretty pragmatic, right?
Right,
Uh, but because it can be and because it can be straightforward in that way, you get the occasional egghead that'll say it can't be that simple, and in a nutshell, they'll say you're a rube if you're following pragmatism. You haven't really thought through your worldview, and you need to be more careful. And my reaction to that is, well, just because you can explain it simply doesn't mean that it's wrong. And
right,
again, you're entitled to your own viewpoint. And if I'm taking the tenets of dialectical pluralism seriously, I have to listen to you and try to account for your point of view. So but the one thing that I try to be careful about is let's lay off the notion of it being a war then.
right.
Yeah.
So
Um,
who first started to like make the Reese's peanut butter cup? You know, they took the chocolate and the peanut butter and they're like, these belong together.
yeah, that's a really interesting thing because there are mixed methods. Students of mixed methods research will point out that the notion of mixed methods has been around for a long time. We just didn't name it that.
Gotcha.
And so you can actually start to look back to some of the older methods that have been used in some of the oldest social sciences and say, yeah, no one thought that it was a bad idea to follow up and conduct an interview if they found some outlier in a regression model and said, what the heck is going on here?
Right, right.
So mixed methods is funny in that way because it's a field that's got its own set of journals. It's got its own conferences. If you go to national conferences like American Evaluation Association or American Education Research Association, that you'll find mixed methods groups within that.
That's
So
true.
it's a cohesive setting, but at the same time, it's challenged by this idea that one might argue mixed methods has always been around. It's just that the phraseology was developed in part because of notions like the incompatibility thesis, right? They say, well, if you cannot mix methods, then what does that even mean? And then all of a sudden you get people like me a few decades later saying, yeah, I'm a mixed methods researcher. And it is one of those things too that since we're dating ourselves and we're talking about things from days of yore, do you remember
Days of your
Tootsie
work.
Rolls?
Yeah, Tootsie Rolls. Yeah.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah.
dude. Okay, we could.
I love Tootsie Rolls.
Yeah, do you remember that commercial where they'd say everything I look and see becomes a Tootsie Roll to me? Do you remember that? So it's a jingle.
Oh, yeah.
So basically, you see this cartoon where people would the kids would see like an airplane flying in the sky, and then the airplane would all of a sudden in the cartoon setting look like it's flying Tootsie Roll, and it's just because
Oh
we were eating
yeah.
them. Yeah, remember that? Yeah.
Yeah,
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 that's
yeah,
very
yeah.
visual. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So I see mixed methods that way for me. I can almost always see a mixed methods research application for almost any kind of evaluation or research question I might pursue. It doesn't mean I always use mixed methods, right? But sometimes it's a budgets or time or expertise won't allow for it. But that doesn't mean I wouldn't at least ask the question, if I could use mixed methods, what might I do? And ideally, most of the time, I am able to enter into a design and say, yeah, mixed methods is part of this project, and we're going to make sure it's baked into the DNA of the question that we have.
Yeah. I think people might not always understand that there is sort of a art to like using the mixed methods. Like I know a lot of people might put in their report like, oh, we do all this statistical analysis and here we did a few like interviews and oh, here's some like quotes in the side of the report. And that's not what we're really talking about. It's more of an integration, right, between the two.
Yeah, and so for a really good entree into that, anybody who's interested in getting an accessible way to think about mixed methods initially, I recommend that they take a look at John Creswell and Vicki Plano-Clark's well-regarded, highly cited textbooks because they actually list a series of six kinds of designs that are out there that'll help you think about that art. Anybody who would look at that excellent work to also know that there's lots of other ways in which these designs can be categorized, and so that it's a good start, but I just would ask people not to stop there if they really want to dive into these things. But I think keep it pretty simple. When we're thinking about the art of mixing of methods, ask a couple of questions at the design stage. So think about this as the plan that we develop, and are we going to follow that plan in mixed methods? Do we want to think about the sequencing of different methods that are there? Is that important? So it's hard to conduct surveys and interviews literally at the same time, but if you're in a scenario where you conduct some interviews first and then you conduct some surveys, but it's immaterial, the timing of it, you could just as easily reverse it, then you would be in a world where from a sequencing point of view, you in essence have a kind of concurrent design. Or you might be working in a team in which they literally can do these things at the same time. Like, hey, go out, Stacey, please lead some interviews, and Bill, you handle the survey, and time is immaterial. But then you could also say, well, no, there is a design where the sequencing of those methods is extremely important to answer my question. For example, I might be in a scenario where I'm conducting work in a country I don't know very well, say Sri Lanka, or I've actually been involved in some work. This goes back a couple of decades. But I grew up as a U.S. citizen, and I'm quite familiar with U.S. culture, and I don't know a lot about the Sri Lankan context, and so it might make sense to engage in a fair amount of qualitative inquiry to really understand the issues that are happening there before I designed a survey for that culture.
Yeah.
And so that would be a sequence design. And now John Creswell would call that and Vicki Plano-Clark would call that an exploratory sequential design. And they use that phrasing because you're first exploring, and then your sequencing matters because the nature of your survey is going to be grounded in what you learned in that first qualitative set of inquiries. Because you might
Right.
find that there are issues that matter a lot, say amongst Sri Lankan teenagers that would be really surprising in a U.S. context, and you want to account for those before you do your survey design. Sequencing can also matter if you flip the order of these things, and you could have an initial set of quantitatively oriented work, and let's say you have some sort of a model that you're doing using regression or whatever, and you identify a series of outliers, and you think, gosh, they're really hard to explain. This is a group that should have benefited from some treatment and they didn't, and I don't know why. So I'm going to do a follow-up series of case studies. And so we would call that a sequential explanatory design. And to kind of keep that simple, it's
Yeah.
because I got this set of findings that are out there. They're kind of odd, and I want to explain them. So sequencing is a way to think about the art of mixing methods. And if you have a good plan, then integration of those methods sort of naturally follow along. And another way to think about integration, and this is an important idea, is the notion of weighting. In other words, the importance of qualitative versus quantitative methods. Is this more of a qualitatively oriented design and you're engaging in some statistical analyses to really build that up, or is this much more of like this is really heavily a quantitative design, but I'm going to do a little bit of follow on qualitative. And so, or you can have what's called an equally balanced design. The weighting, you can think about the level of effort and how much of your budget and how important these different methods are there. Is there equal weight between them? And if you think about those sequencing and weighting questions relative to what your research purpose is, then you're getting into the art of mixing of methods. And then you're also getting into a pre-planned way of thinking about integration. That help?
Yeah, that helps.
Yeah,
Good.
definitely. I definitely like the point about Stacey you brought up about how is it like a true integration of methods rather than just kind of like lip service to the idea of mixed methods because somebody's made that requirement and you're like, well, we're really going to do a quantitative thing, but so that we're saying that we're doing mixed methods, we're going to sprinkle in some of these, qualitative methods.
Yeah. And in fact, that reminds me of another way of planning this, because then you could get into the notion of to what extent is integration really important to your methods. You can have, in essence, what we would think of as a kind of a parallel design. And there's some controversy is that does that even mean that you're mixing methods? For example, that would be if I'm engaging in some quantitative work and some qualitative work, and they never really meet in between.
I don't
That's
consider that mixed methods.
Yeah, then it gets kind of weird. But then you could get on the other end of the continuum where integration is heavily, heavily involved with what your work will be. I'll give you an example. There is work in the mixed methods realm where what one can do is quantify qualitative information. So suppose I go through, I'm doing some work in a school district, and the gist of my work is students who are in a sexual minority category. They're not straight, feel unsafe.
Mhm.
Right. And I conduct a series of interviews with them. And it turns out the way in which they feel unsafe can be thematically categorized. Like
Mhm.
that's like I feel unsafe when it comes to my physical safety, or I feel unsafe when it comes to my emotional safety. And so what I end up doing is I learn about those different facets of safety through conducting interviews and conducting thematic analysis, right? Well, what if I turn around and I say, now I'm going to code those. I'm going to give those numbers. Like, physical safety is a one, emotional safety is a two, relational, or what's another kind of safety I might think about? My standing amongst my peers is a three. And then what I do is I subject those coded thematic numbers to some sort of statistical analysis. That can be a highly, highly integrated approach where I start to get some insights into how I think about safety among these kids that might be revealed more easily through some regression model than what I might have seen had I just stuck with qualitative methods only. And in that case, you can have studies that again are pretty parallel, and you wonder about the extent to which they really integrate with each other. To the other end of the continuum where it's so heavily integrated, how could it not be mixed methods?
Example, Stacey and I were on a project actually where we were coding interviews. Do you remember this, Stacey?
Oh yeah, there was
It was
a
some years ago.
school climate or whatever.
Yeah, it was like school
Yeah.
climate. It was a federally funded project, and we had a bunch of interviews, 1 hour interviews with like I think maybe 60 or 100 subjects. I can't remember.
Yeah, it was quite a bit.
Yeah, and so we did a lot of coding, qualitative coding. And once we got to a particular point, it's like, well, we've got a lot of counts here. Can we just do some really basic quantitative stuff with this so that we can, talk in some rational way about what were the most common themes and in what situations those were. And so that led to kind of integrating, I guess, at that point, a mixed methods approach.
Yeah, that sounds like that'd be consistent with what I was just describing. Stacey, does that sound right?
Yeah, I think that sounds right. No,
And
I
that
know.
actually opens up another facet of mixed methods, which is kind of an interesting thing about which there is no shortage of controversy. But I've run into scenarios where my championing the idea of be a champion of the idea of quantitating, sorry, quantitizing thematic information is criticized. And the
Mhm.
reason why is because those in the qualitative realm, some of whom might sort of be espousing the notion of the incompatibility thesis, would say you're losing so much of the richness of the data when you put a number to something like that. How can you do that? I
Yeah.
mean, it's awful. My reaction in response to that is, well, just because you quantize, that's the proper way of saying it, quantize thematic information doesn't mean that's the only way in which you conduct your analysis. You can have your
Right.
cake and eat it too. I can say, well, yeah, I ran, I did some descriptive analysis on quantified themes, but that doesn't mean I still can't stick with the tried and true description of thematic analyses. And why would I balance these things out or use these different approaches? It really just depends on what I'm trying to do when answering my research question. Like I would use that as the justification. What becomes interesting about that though is if you get into the idea of assigning numbers to themes, you can do the opposite of that. You could do what's called qualitizing. And what qualitizing would entail is suppose I had some survey and I used a Likert style response, strongly agree, agree, disagree. Maybe I asked the question, what fruits do you like? Or I like apples, and you get into strongly agree or not. And let's say, for example, I have subgroups that are much more prone to say they like apples than others. And I could qualitize that numerical information and by conducting interviews and say, I see that you really don't like apples. Like what's the deal with that? Give me that detail. And that's another kind of heavy integration because I might not have thought to ask in-depth question about apple preferences until I had observed that's an issue. Because up until this point, I might have just assumed that everybody sort of likes apples. How do you like them apples? And that opens up this idea then, which is a group, and I happen to agree with them, where they made an argument about this idea of taking the Q out of research. I don't mean QAnon stuff. I mean, stop referring to things as qualitative versus quantitative because those labels can get confusing. Because if I say, well, yeah, I just conducted a study where I had a series of numerically coded themes, is that quantitative or qualitative research? It's just it's just research. I mean, what are you worried about this for? The other part about it is it does kind of reify or reinforce this notion of there being quantitative and qualitative camps,
Mm,
where if we think, hey, look, I've got a research question it's going to be really well answered if I can open myself to a combination of surveys and experiments and document analyses and observations. And let's not get so hung up on were you a quantitative researcher or a qualitative researcher? I'm just a researcher.
right.
And so
I
I
like that.
kind of like that idea too, because I don't like the idea of developing these camps.
Yeah, me either.
Yeah.
Although
And
I do like it because it helps me to set myself apart.
yeah, yeah, it is one of those things where labels have their value so long as you're careful about how you're using them. I do a lot of work in the special education realm, and we have students with disabilities, and they have federal labels that we apply to them that kind of gives you a sense of what issues they have, but only up until a point. And so, like, if I might say a student has a specific learning disability, well, in what? How bad is it? What have you tried to do to address this learning disability? Do we think it's a permanent thing, or is this, hearing learning disability is a beginning to understanding what that student's needs might be, but it's certainly not an end. And I kind of think about that when people identify themselves as a qualitative researcher or a quantitative researcher or a mixed methods researcher. I would just, someone says, "Hey, I'm a quantitative researcher," then I would probably think that you're pretty good at stats, but that doesn't mean you can't do interviews.
Yeah, lately I've been
Absolutely.
saying I'm mixed methods, but I lean quantitative because I do every. Someone once called me a Renaissance evaluator because I do everything.
Oh, I like that. That's
Yeah,
great.
so
Renaissance evaluator.
Renaissance evaluator.
That's a nice way of saying mixed methods. Wow.
Yeah, so I feel like I need one of those hats, like from my PhD, like the
Yeah,
the
that's a
soft
good one.
velvet beret sort of thing,
The giant collar that sticks
giant
out.
collar.
Yeah, that's funny.
That'll be
A
change
beret
my
that,
LinkedIn profile to look like that.
I
no,
love
if I dressed up like that, I'd start to look like Henry VIII. Uh, so yeah, when it comes to this mixed methods realm, people, there are reasons why we want to label ourselves, but I just, like I said, I've learned over time to be careful with labels. Where I run into this a lot too is actually when I'm dealing with dissertations. People would say, I'm doing a quantitative study or I'm doing a qualitative study. And then I'll be stuck there saying, well, what does that mean? I don't understand. Like, can you be more specific? Well, I'm doing, since you asked, I'm engaging in a case study and I have some ethnographic blends that are in there. Okay, good. Now I understand that. But qualitative to me is so broad, I don't get what you mean. And
right. Yeah.
we probably
Right.
run into that more in the qualitative realm because but I do occasionally see students say, well, I'm doing quantitative work and I'll say okay, is that an experiment? Is that a regression analysis? Are you conducting a survey? What that is so broad, it's almost meaningless.
Yeah, that's a good point.
No, thanks. I'll try. I can wrap up with a summary set of thoughts.
Okay, yeah.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Okay.
So summarize
So
what
to
we've learned today.
summarize, yeah. Anybody who's listening to this, I encourage our listeners to learn more about mixed methods research. I think it's a powerful way of thinking about inquiry. And why would you not want to avail yourself to all the different methodologies that are out there to make sure you answer your questions well? If you want to start to dive into this area, a couple of things just to keep in mind is it's hard to be good at everything. And so oftentimes in the mixed methods realm, you'll work in teams. Stacey and I have worked on a couple of publications together, and she's far superior than I am in a couple of arenas. And what I'll do is let her cook on her thing while I think about the mixed method side of pieces. And so conducting work in teams is often how mixed methods is done.
Mhm.
The whole idea behind it is you can develop what we talk about is this notion of synergy in mixed methods research. By synergy, we mean the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The late great Mike Fetters, who is a mixed methods researcher who we lost in the last couple of years, I forget the exact date. Folks like Tim Guterman and John Creswell had this 1 + 1 = 3 phraseology that they would use, and that's what they mean by synergy. You could learn more using mixed methods than if you would have just used a quantitative versus qualitative approach alone. And in the end, I encourage other folks to look into this because I find it could be a lot of fun. It allows you to start to articulate some pretty complex questions and developing the capacity to answer them. And I think that's my summary. And thanks for your time and thanks for listening.
Oh yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is awesome.
Yeah,
Yeah, this
thanks.
is great.
Well, hopefully you have me back and we'll talk about some other issues in some future date.
Oh yeah, totally.
Absolutely.